The salt spray was a constant companion here, a fine mist that clung to my skin and tasted of brine and something else, something older. I'd come to this coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, seeking. I'm not entirely sure. Quiet, perhaps. A place where the relentless hum of the city, the echoes of my own life, might finally fade. Instead, I found a different kind of silence, one punctuated by the mournful cries of gulls and the rhythmic sigh of the tide against weathered docks. My small cottage, smelling perpetually of damp wood and the faint, lingering aroma of my wife's lavender sachets, offered little solace. Her absence was a hollow space in the air, a missing note in the symphony of my days. Sarah. The name still caught in my throat, a sharp shard of memory. She'd loved the stars, too, though her gaze was always softer, more romantic than mine. We were two different kinds of astronomers, orbiting the same quiet universe. Now my universe felt fractured. I was an astrophysicist adrift, the vastness of space no longer a subject of study, but a mirror reflecting my own profound loneliness. I'd retreated, bringing only my work, my books, and the gnawing emptiness. The data stream from the Kepler telescope, usually a source of detached fascination, had become an obsession in the weeks since Sarah's passing. It was a flood of numbers, light curves, and spectral analyses, a digital representation of distant suns. I'd spent countless nights hunched over my laptop, the blue light illuminating my tired face, tracing patterns, searching for anomalies that might, for a fleeting moment, pull me out of myself. This village, with its narrow, winding streets and houses huddled together against the wind, was supposed to be an escape. The fishermen, their faces etched with the harsh realities of their trade, moved with a quiet stoicism I envied. They mended nets with practiced hands, their conversations punctuated by the creak of boat masts and the distant roar of the sea. They understood a fundamental truth. The world was a dangerous, unpredictable place, and survival depended on grit and tradition. My world, the world of theoretical physics, felt abstract, distant, almost irrelevant. But the stars, they were the constant. They were always there, indifferent to human sorrow, to the petty dramas of our lives. And that's what drew me back to the data. It was a form of communion, a way to touch something eternal, something that existed beyond the confines of my grief. It started subtly. A flicker, a deviation in a light curve that shouldn't have been there. A star designated Kepler 186f, a planet in its star's habitable zone, had always been a point of interest. But the readings I was seeing now were wrong. The dips in its star's light, the subtle shifts in spectrum, they didn't conform to any known planetary transit or stellar activity. It was like a faint, rhythmic pulse, too regular for natural variation, too complex for instrumental error. I'd recalibrated everything. I'd run diagnostics until my eyes burned. I'd cross-referenced with other observatories. The anomaly persisted. It was a whisper in the cosmic static, a deviation so profound it felt like a deliberate act. The old lighthouse keeper, a man whose weathered face seemed carved from driftwood, would sometimes nod to me as I walked along the cliff path. He'd seen more tides turn than I'd seen stars rise. He spoke little, but his eyes, the color of the deep sea, held a certain knowing. He'd once mentioned the old ways, the stories his grandfather told him about the sea's moods, about signs and portents. I dismissed it then, a charming local superstition. Now, staring at the peculiar data, the words felt like they carried a different weight. The anomaly wasn't just a blip, it was a pattern. And the more I analyzed it, the more intricate and deliberate it became. It wasn't just Kepler 186f. Similar, though fainter, signatures were appearing in the data from other distant exoplanets. A network, a signal. My hands, usually steady, began to tremble as I worked. The air in the cottage, usually thick with Sarah's lavender, felt charged, electric. I pushed the data further, applying algorithms I developed for detecting subtle gravitational influences. What I found made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It wasn't a signal from the planets. It was a signal acting upon them. A subtle, pervasive influence. It was like watching a cosmic weaver, its threads invisible, manipulating the very fabric of distant systems. The implications were enormous. This wasn't some natural phenomenon, this was something else. I pulled up the orbital data for Earth, my own solar system, my own planet, my own home. I ran the same analysis, my heart racing with a frantic, uneven rhythm. The results came back stark and terrifying. A faint, almost imperceptible trace. A nascent pattern, it was there, beginning. Was I seeing things? Or was something out there in the silent, indifferent expanse finally turning its attention towards us? The old lighthouse keeper, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, nodded curtly when I showed him the chart. He didn't speak, just pointed a gnarled finger towards the churning gray sea. The wind here, it didn't just blow, it gnawed. It carried the scent of dead fish and kelp, a primal, unsettling aroma that clung to the back of my throat. My rented cottage, perched precariously on the cliff edge, creaked and groaned with every gust, a symphony of decay that mirrored the state of my own mind. I'd been staring at the data for days, the flickering screen of my laptop a meager beacon against the encroaching dusk. The readings from the deep space array, the one I'd cobbled together with salvaged parts and sheer desperation, were impossible. They defied every known law of physics. Not just a blip, not a sensor malfunction. This was a pattern, intricate and vast like a cosmic fingerprint. It had appeared, then vanished, leaving me questioning my sanity. Sarah's ghost, I'd told myself, a phantom in the static, but the data, it felt too real, too present. Tonight it was back. The faint hum of the equipment in the small shed behind the cottage had intensified. It was a low thrum, resonating not just in my ears but in my bones, a deep vibration that felt alien and ancient. I pulled on my heavy wool coat, the rough fibers scratching against my skin, and stepped out into the biting wind. The sky was a bruised purple, stars beginning to prick through the darkening canvas. The sea below crashed against the rocks with a percussive roar, each wave a hammer blow against the shore. The shed door, warped by damp, groaned open, revealing the cluttered space. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting humming consoles and blinking lights. The air inside was thick with the smell of ozone and something else. A faint, metallic tang like old blood. The central monitor, usually a calm blue, was now alive with chaotic, swirling patterns of light, a vortex of impossible colors that seemed to bleed into the edges of my vision. The hum was louder here, a physical pressure against my eardrums. I approached the console, my hands trembling. The anomaly was blooming, expanding across the screen, a complex geometric shape that shifted and reformed with agonizing slowness. It was beautiful in a terrifying, alien way. Not a star, not a nebula, not anything catalogued. It was deliberate. The patterns resolved into something akin to script, but unlike any language I had ever encountered. It was not written but woven, a tapestry of pure information that pulsed with an unseen energy. My breath hitched. This wasn't a glitch. This was a message. Or worse, a presence. The sheer scale of it, the implied intelligence behind it, was overwhelming. It dwarfed human understanding, dwarfed the very concept of existence as I knew it. I felt a profound sense of insignificance, a dizzying plunge into the abyss of the unknown. I needed to record this, to analyze it. But a primal instinct screamed at me to shut it down, to sever the connection, to pretend I hadn't seen. I remembered Sarah's laugh, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when he was truly happy. That memory, once a bomb, now felt like a raw wound. He had loved the stars, too. Had she ever felt this? This terrifying sense of being watched by something that saw us as less than dust. The geometric patterns on the screen began to coalesce, to focus. A single, impossibly bright point of light emerged from the swirling chaos, growing larger, brighter, until it filled the monitor. It wasn't a light I recognized. It was a color that didn't exist, a hue that twisted my perception, making the very air in the shed seem to warp. It felt like staring into the eye of something ancient and impossibly vast. A single, guttural sound escaped my lips, a choked gasp. The hum intensified, rising to an almost unbearable pitch. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, acrid, and suffocating. Then the light on the screen pulsed. Once, twice. And with each pulse, the cottage above me seemed to groan, the very foundations of the cliff vibrating. The single point of light on the screen. It wasn't just on the screen anymore. It felt like it was looking out. Was it looking at me? It carried the scent of dead fish and kelp, a primal, ancient stench that clung to everything. I thanked him, my voice swallowed by the gale, and turned back towards the ramshackle cottage he called home. The sea spray, thick and cold, misted my glasses, blurring the already indistinct outline of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks below. He'd understood, at least partially. The symbols I'd sketched, remnants of the fragmented data I'd salvaged, were not entirely alien to him. He'd seen them, he indicated with a series of gestures and grunts, etched into driftwood, into the worn stones of the oldest jetties. He called them star marks, relics of a time before the boats, before the village itself. A time when the sky, he seemed to imply, was more present. Back in my temporary lodgings, a cramped room above the village pub that smelled perpetually of stale ale and damp wool, I spread out my salvaged printouts. The flickering oil lamp cast dancing shadows, distorting the lines, making the strange patterns writhe like something alive. The lighthouse keeper's star marks were crude, almost childish renderings, but they resonated with the core structure of the anomaly. It was like finding a child's drawing of a supernova. Crude, yes, but undeniably the same phenomenon. The data was corrupted, fragmented, but persistent. It wasn't just noise. It was a signal modulated in a way I couldn't comprehend. It spoke of frequencies far beyond anything the standard cosmic microwave background could account for. Frequencies that seemed to respond. I remembered the days before Sarah's laughter became a memory I could barely grasp. I traced a particularly complex set of overlapping waveforms. They weren't random. There was a rhythm, a deliberate cadence. And the origin point, triangulated with what little accurate data I had, wasn't a distant galaxy or a nebula or even a known pulsar. It was closer, disturbingly closer. The data implied a structure, a vast, interconnected lattice of energy that permeated the very fabric of space-time. It wasn't just light and matter. It was something else, something that organized. I ran simulations, feeding the corrupted fragments into my portable analysis unit. The results were unsettling. The patterns suggested a form of consciousness, ancient and immeasurably powerful, that treated the universe not as a canvas, but as a medium to be sculpted, to be rearranged. I remembered the old fisherman's words, translated by the innkeeper's daughter, a girl with eyes as gray and stormy as the sea outside. He'd spoken of the deep song, a hum that the oldest among them could sometimes feel in their bones, especially during the fiercest storms. A song that preceded the fishing nets, the boats, the very idea of the village. I cross-referenced the spectral signature with historical astronomical anomalies, with the forgotten lore of coastal communities that lived and died by the sea. They were dismissed as folklore, as the ramblings of superstitious minds. The signal wasn't just originating from a localized point. It was radiating outwards like ripples from a stone dropped into a pond, and the direction of the most intense radiation. It was no longer a distant celestial body. It was moving, shifting. And the simulations, running with increasing urgency, were pointing towards a convergence, a focal point. My hands trembled as I adjusted the gain on the analysis unit. The spectral lines sharpened, coalescing into a distinct, pulsing entity. It wasn't just a signal anymore, it was a presence. And its attention, I realized with a sickening lurch, was no longer diffused, it was focused. The wind outside howled, a mournful, keening sound that seemed to echo the rising panic in my own throat. I looked at the chart again, at the crude star marks that now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The lighthouse keeper had pointed to the sea, but the data pointed upwards, and the convergence. It was heading towards me, towards us. There was this intelligence truly aware of my efforts, Was it a conscious entity, or merely a cosmic process unfolding with indifferent inevitability? The old lighthouse keeper's gaze, when it finally settled on me, was as heavy and ancient as the stones of his tower. He was a man carved by salt and wind, his skin a weathered parchment. He'd merely grunted, a sound like pebbles rolling in a tide, and pointed. That was all the instruction I needed. The chart I'd shown him, a crude map of celestial anomalies I'd traced from the data, had elicited no surprise. It was a language he understood, perhaps, in a way I was only beginning to grasp. I walked out of the shadow of the lighthouse, the wind whipping my coat around me. It tasted of brine and something else, something metallic and sharp that clawed at the back of my throat. The coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, huddled against the relentless sea. Nets lay drying on weathered docks, their intricate patterns echoing the very cosmic webs I studied. The air was thick with the scent of tar and curing fish, a primal aroma that grounded me momentarily in the tangible. Yet my mind was already adrift, pulled by the unseen currents of the anomaly. I'd spent weeks in that village, a ghost among living souls, drawn by the whispers of its isolation. The keeper, a man named Silas, was a repository of forgotten lore, his stories woven from the sea's endless cycle of birth and decay. He spoke of lights in the sky that predated any star charts, of patterns in the waves that mirrored no earthly tide. He'd initially dismissed me, the city man with his fancy instruments and haunted eyes. But the chart, that strange confluence of my scientific rigor and his ancestral intuition, had finally pierced his reserve. He'd pointed towards the horizon, a place where the gray sky bled into the gray sea. The deep, he'd rasped, his voice like barnacles scraping against wood. It remembers. I rented a small skiff, a sturdy if battered vessel that smelled of diesel and dried seaweed. The waves slapped against its hull with a steady rhythm, a percussive beat that amplified the thrumming in my own chest. My equipment was minimal, a portable spectrometer and a long-range directional microphone, salvaged from my abandoned research. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, only that the keeper's cryptic gesture, the way his eyes had widened infinitesimally, had ignited a desperate hope. The further I rode from the shore, the more the world seemed to shrink, the village becoming a smudge of distant lights. The wind grew colder, biting through my layers of wool. The sea, once merely choppy, began to churn with an unsettling energy. It wasn't the predictable swell of a storm, but a series of disjointed, almost violent, undulations. I adjusted the spectrometer, its needle twitching erratically. There were faint energy signatures here, subtle fluctuations that shouldn't have existed in such a remote, unpopulated area. I pointed the directional microphone towards a particularly turbulent patch of water, where the waves seemed to twist in on themselves. The static that crackled through the headphones was overwhelming at first, a deafening roar of white noise. I filtered it painstakingly, searching for any discernible pattern, and then I heard it. Beneath the chaotic hiss, a faint, rhythmic pulse. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever encountered, a series of low, resonant tones that seemed to vibrate not just in my ears but in my very bones. The pulses weren't random. They formed a complex sequence, a language of pure vibration. My hands trembled as I tried to record it, the cheap microphone struggling to capture the nuances. Deliberate. It felt like a signal, ancient and impossibly alien. I scanned the sea surface with the spectrometer again. The energy readings spiked, concentrated in the area where the sound was strongest. Not a current signal, but the fading echo of something that had been here, something powerful, something that had left its mark on the very fabric of this place. Images flashed through my mind. The keeper's weathered face, the lines etched by years of observation, the intricate patterns of the fishing nets, a human attempt to ensnare the incomprehensible, the swirling, chaotic dance of the waves. These weren't isolated incidents. They were echoes. Now it felt like a Rosetta Stone, a key to unlocking a hidden history. The entity hadn't just observed, it had interacted. It had left its mark on worlds long before Earth. And this village, with its deep connection to the sea, its ancient rhythms, had unknowingly preserved a sliver of its passage. The pulses grew fainter, the energy signature receding. It was as if the ocean itself was exhaling, the last vestiges of the presence dissipating into the vastness. This wasn't just a cosmic phenomenon, it was a history of influence, of unseen hands shaping the universe. Had they always been there, these echoes? Or was this a new disturbance, a sign that its attention had once again turned towards us? The wind picked up, carrying a spray of icy water that stung my face. It felt like a warning, the deep remembered, Silas had said. But what else did it forget? The skiff pitched, a sharp lurch that sent a spray of icy water over my face. The air tasted of salt and something else, something metallic and sharp that I couldn't quite place. It clung to my tongue, a phantom residue of the sea. I adjusted the microphone, its sensitive dish pointed towards the inky blackness that swallowed the horizon. The rhythmic slap of waves against the hull was no longer a comfort. It was a countdown. I'd come to this coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, seeking isolation. A place where the insistent hum of the city, the constant reminder of Sarah's absence, would finally fade. But isolation, I was learning, was a poor shield against the truth. The truth, in my case, was a cold, vast thing, blooming in the sterile glow of my laptop screen. The data streams were relentless, a river of incomprehensible numbers and spectral signatures that had begun to bleed into my dreams. Not just random noise, I told myself, staring at the faint, recurring patterns. Not just a glitch in the cosmic background radiation. There was a deliberate architecture to it, a subtle, alien geometry, and it was growing stronger. My portable spectrometer whirred, its internal fan a tiny whisper against the roar of the ocean. I was monitoring a specific frequency band, one that had in the past week shown a peculiar resonance. It was a whisper at first, a ghost in the machine. Now it was a low, insistent thrum, a vibration that seemed to echo in my bones. The anomaly wasn't static, it was evolving. Its spectral fingerprint was shifting, refining. It was learning, or perhaps it was preparing. A wave larger than the others slammed into the skiff. The vessel groaned, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the deck. I braced myself, my grip tight where I gripped the edge of the console. The sky above was a bruised purple, the stars beginning to prick through the deepening twilight. One star, brighter than the rest, seemed to pulse with an unnatural intensity. I zoomed in on the spectral data. The resonance I'd been tracking was peaking. Not just peaking, but coalescing. It was forming a coherent signal, a complex waveform that defied any known astrophysical phenomenon. It was too ordered, too intentional. My breath hitched. I ran a comparative analysis, cross-referencing the current readings with archived data from various celestial events. Supernova, gamma-ray bursts, quasar emissions, nothing matched. This was something new, something that hadn't been observed before. Then my gaze drifted to a different set of charts, the ones detailing upcoming astronomical alignments, the ones I'd dismissed as academic curiosities, statistical curiosities, and there it was, a confluence, a rare, almost impossible alignment of distant celestial bodies scheduled to occur in precisely 72 hours. A cosmic alignment so precise, so geometrically perfect, it was usually relegated to theoretical models. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I fed the spectral data into the alignment model. The system churned, its fans whirring a frantic counterpoint to the storm building within me. The results flashed on the screen, stark and undeniable. The anomaly's resonance wasn't just present during the alignment, it was keyed to it. The shifting waveforms, the refining signal, they were a symphony tuning itself for a grand, horrifying performance. The entity, whatever it was using the universe itself as a stage. And this alignment, this cosmic ballet, was its overture. A shiver traced its way down my spine, independent of the biting wind. The metallic tang in the air intensified, no longer a phantom. It was real, a faint, coppery scent that seemed to emanate from the sea itself. The water around the skiff had grown unnervingly still, the waves that had been so boisterous now mere ripples. I looked at the brighter star again. The data on my screen was no longer just numbers. It was a map, a road map to something vast and terrible. And the entity wasn't just observing, it was orchestrating, it was reaching out. This wasn't a passive observation. This was an active participation. The anomaly was a harbinger, a signal that the entity was about to do something. Something tied to this specific cosmic event. Something that would reshape the very fabric of existence. My hands trembled, the cursor dancing erratically across the screen. I felt a profound sense of insignificance, a tiny speck adrift in an ocean of cosmic indifference. But indifference was too gentle a word. This was a deliberate, powerful force, wielding the universe like a sculptor's clay, and it was looking my way. The stillness of the water was broken by a single, deep thrum from beneath the hull. It wasn't the engine, it wasn't the sea. Something ancient and resonant. What was this alignment meant to achieve? And why was the entity drawing my attention to it? I adjusted the microphone. Its sensitive dish pointed towards the Inkai expanse of the North Atlantic. The hum of the engine was a low thrum beneath my boots, a familiar comfort in the vast indifference of the ocean. It was here, miles from any shore, that the whispers of the cosmos felt loudest, clearest. I'd spent weeks poring over the raw data, not the polished, curated streams the Institute fed the public, but the unfiltered, sickening flood of information that spilled from the deep space arrays. It was in those jagged peaks and aberrant troughs that I'd found it. A pattern, a melody woven into the static of existence, a deliberate, intricate signature that spoke of an intelligence so profound it made my marrow ache. My wife, Alara, had always said I chased ghosts in the static. Now I feared I'd found one, and it was far more terrifying than any specter she'd ever imagined. The metallic tang in the air wasn't just the sea. It was the faint, omnipresent scent of ozone, a byproduct of something immense interacting with our atmosphere. The data suggested it wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a communication, or more chillingly, a broadcast. And the source of that broadcast was not distant. It was closer, much closer than I dared to admit even to myself. I steered the skiff back towards the jagged coastline, the lights of the coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, a faint smear against the bruised twilight. The village was a cluster of weathered cottages huddled against the relentless wind, their slate roofs slick with sea spray. It was a place where the old ways held fast, where the rhythm of the tides dictated life, and where the strangeness of the universe was a distant, abstract concern. I found the village elder, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles and sea-battered resilience, mending nets on the docks. His hands, gnarled and strong, moved with a practiced grace that spoke of generations. "Excuse me," I began, my voice rough from disuse. I need to speak with someone." He looked up, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, regarding me with a mild curiosity. "I read the Stargazer," he stated, his voice a low rumble like pebbles on the shore. He gestured with a thumb towards my small research vessel bobbing at its mooring. "Come to watch the new moon." "No," I said, stepping closer, the scent of brine and fish guts thick around us. It's about the sky. There's something wrong." He paused, his fingers stilling their work. "The sea's been rough lately," he conceded. "The mackerel are running late, but wrong is a strong word, Stargazer. It's more than the sea," I insisted, the words tumbling out, a desperate cascade. "The stars, the patterns are shifting. I've detected an influence, something ancient and vast. It's not natural." I fumbled in my pocket, pulling out a small, encrypted data drive. "I have the readings, the energy signatures. They're unlike anything we've ever recorded." He took the drive, turning it over in his calloused palm. He didn't plug it into anything. He simply held it, his gaze drifting back to the churning sea. "We don't have much use for my numbers, Stargazer. We watch the birds, we feel the wind, we read the tides, the sky. It's always been there. It doesn't change. But it is changing." My voice rose, cracking with frustration. "This is important. This is a threat to all of us." He handed the drive back to me, his expression unreadable. The sea gives and the sea takes. We respect that. We don't try to understand it. We just live with it. He resumed his net mending, the rhythmic pull and nodding, a stark contrast to my own frantic energy. Perhaps I should do the same. I stood there, the wind whipping my hair around my face, the metallic taste in the air suddenly suffocating. They saw the sea, the sky, the predictable cycles of nature. They couldn't comprehend a force that could rewrite those cycles, that could warp the very fabric of existence. I turned away, my shoulders slumped. The isolation pressed in, a tangible weight. I was alone with this knowledge, utterly, terrifyingly alone. As I walked back towards my skiff, the metallic tang seemed to intensify, a subtle sweetness now, almost sickly. And if they were, what did they see? The salty spray stung my eyes, a familiar sensation in this windswept place. But today it carried a new kind of bite, a sharp, almost acrid tang that clawed at my throat. I'd expected questions, perhaps skepticism, from the elders of this coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced. I'd found only a profound, unsettling stillness. They watched me, their faces weathered like ancient driftwood, their eyes holding a deep, unreadable knowledge. They offered no comfort, no shared terror, only a quiet resignation that felt like a judgment. My own terror, however, was a live thing, a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. The data I'd brought, the raw, unadulterated hum of the universe singing its awful song, had been met with nods and murmured pronouncements about tides and seasons. They saw the stars, yes, but they saw them as they always had, predictable and distant. They did not see the chasm opening beneath them. I turned away from the stoic faces, the weathered stone of their homes. The wind seemed to keen now, a mournful sound that snaked through the narrow lanes, rustling the drying nets. It felt like a preamble, a drawn-out breath before a scream. The air, once bracing, now felt thick, heavy with an unseen pressure. My lungs ached with each inhale. Back in the small, damp room I'd rented, the crackle of static from my portable receiver was a constant companion. It had been my sole focus for weeks, this relentless stream of anomalous energy readings. They pulsed and warped, defying every known law of physics. They were not random. They were a language, or worse, a presence. I spread the printouts across the rough wooden table. The numbers blurred, but the patterns remained like a cosmic watermark on reality itself. My wife's face, a ghost in the periphery of my vision, seemed to plead with me. He had loved the order of things, the elegant mathematics of the cosmos. This was the antithesis of all that. This was chaos, not in the random sense, but in the deliberate, directed chaos of a sculptor shaping clay. Except the clay was space-time and the sculptor was. What? A low hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, a sound so subtle at first I dismissed it as the distant engine of a fishing boat. But it grew, a resonant thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath me. The glass of the single window rattled. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy pane. My hands, resting on the data sheets, began to tremble, not from fear, not entirely. It was a sympathetic vibration, as if my own cells were resonating with the growing disturbance. The hum intensified, morphing into a deep, guttural groan. It was the sound of something immense shifting, of tectonic plates grinding in a way they were never meant to. The sky outside, visible through the window, began to change. The usual pale blue deepened, then bled into an unnatural, bruised violet. The sun, a familiar orb, seemed to elongate, its edges softening as if viewed through rippling water. My breath hitched. This was it. Not a warning, not a prelude, but the event. The data had been screaming about it, a siren song of impending alteration. The anomaly wasn't just an energy signature. It was an ingress, a point where something vast and alien was pushing its way into our reality. The groaning sound was now accompanied by a high-pitched whine, an almost unbearable frequency that made my teeth ache. The printouts on the table began to lift, rippling as if caught by an invisible wind. I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady. The world outside was dissolving. The familiar shapes of boats moored in the harbor seemed to waver, their lines blurring, their forms distorting. The sea itself appeared to boil, not with heat, but with an internal, violent agitation. The sky was no longer violet. It was a swirling vortex of impossible colors, hues that had no name, no earthly reference. This was not a natural phenomenon. This was the touch of the entity, its immense will-bending existence to its whim. It was not merely observing, it was remaking. And Earth, this tiny, insignificant speck, was its canvas. I looked at the data again, my eyes scanning the chaotic patterns. There had to be something, a weakness, a point of focus, a way to push back. The thought was ludicrous, like a child throwing pebbles at a mountain, but the alternative was unthinkable. To witness the unraveling, to feel reality itself fray at the edges and do nothing. My gaze fell on a particular sequence, a series of sharp, discordant frequencies that had appeared just before the groaning began. They were unlike anything else, a violent aberration within the anomaly. It was a signature, a focal point. If this entity was a force, it had to have a point of entry, a place where its influence was strongest. My mind, usually a labyrinth of theoretical constructs, narrowed to a single, desperate purpose. I had to amplify it. I had to reflect it. I had to use its own terrifying song against it. But how? How could one man with a few pieces of obsolete equipment hope to alter the course of a cosmic invasion? The room shuddered violently, plaster raining down from the ceiling. The whine reached a crescendo, a sound that threatened to shatter my very bones. What had I unleashed by seeking this knowledge? And more importantly, could I possibly undo it? The salt spray still stung, but the acrid tang was gone, replaced by something sweeter, sickly sweet, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. I stood on the damp, packed earth of the coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, the wind whipping strands of my hair across my face. The elders, their faces like weathered maps, had been silent. Not a single word. They'd simply turned, their gazes fixed on the churning gray sea, their hands moving with a practiced, almost ritualistic grace as they mended nets. Their silence was more unnerving than any shouted accusation. My breath hitched. The air itself felt different, thicker. It hummed with a low, resonant vibration like a colossal bell struck in the deepest trenches of the ocean. My hands trembled as I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the smooth, cool surface of the data chip. It was still there, proof, or it had been. Now I wasn't so sure. I looked at the sky. It was a bruised, mottled purple, a color I'd never seen before, not in any astronomical chart, not in any dream. The sun, if it was the sun, was a pale, diffused disk, casting shadows that seemed to writhe at their edges. The familiar cry of gulls was muted, distorted, as if heard through a layer of water. Everything was subtly, horribly wrong. I turned back towards the village. The thatched roof seemed to sag lower, the wooden structures leaning in on themselves as if burdened by an unseen weight. The scent of fish and brine, usually so sharp and clean, was now overlaid with that cloying sweetness, a scent that made my stomach churn. A child, no older than 5, stood by a fishing boat, his back to me. He was humming a tuneless melody, his small shoulders shaking. I called out to him, my voice a ragged whisper. He didn't turn. I took a step towards him, my boots sinking slightly into the mud. He remained facing the sea. Then the child's humming changed. It deepened, warped, becoming a guttural chant that scraped against my nerves. The sound seemed to emanate not just from his small throat, but from the very air around us. I stopped, my heart racing. It wasn't the frantic, panicked beat I'd grown accustomed to. This was a heavy, leaden thud, a rhythm out of sync with my own body. My gaze snapped back to the sea. The waves, which had been a uniform gray, were now streaked with vibrant, impossible colors: emerald green, sapphire blue, ruby red, swirling and coalescing like oil on water, but on a scale that defied comprehension. The water itself seemed to possess a viscous, oily sheen, and within the depths I saw movement. Not the familiar darting of fish, but slow, deliberate shifts, vast shapes that moved with an alien grace, eclipsing the faint light that penetrated the surface. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a gasp. The data chip felt like a burning coal in my pocket. Was this what the cosmic entity had done? Had it recolored the world? Had it bent the very fabric of perception to its will? This wasn't the universe I knew. This was a canvas it had repainted, and I was trapped within its grotesque masterpiece. A fisherman, his face obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, walked past me. He moved with an unnerving slowness. His eyes, when he briefly glanced my way, were vacant, unseeing. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't even seem to register my presence. It was as if I were a ghost, a mere echo in this reconfigured reality. The sea breeze, which had once been bracing, now felt like a damp, clammy caress, carrying with it that suffocating sweetness. I needed to get away. To find a place where the colors were normal, where the sky was blue, where the sea was just the sea, but where? Every direction I looked, the alien hues bled into the landscape. The familiar, weathered cottages of the village now seemed to shimmer, their outlines blurring as if seen through heat haze, though the air was cool and damp. The scent of decay and unnatural sweetness intensified, making my head spin. I ran. I ran past the silent fishermen, past the humming child, past the leaning houses. I ran towards the cliffs, towards the crashing waves, a desperate, primal urge to escape this painted prison. The wind howled, but it sounded wrong, a mournful dirge that seemed to weep for the world that had been lost. As I reached the edge of the cliffs, the churning sea stretched out before me, a panorama of impossible, swirling colors. The air was thick with the cloying scent, and the low hum vibrated through my very bones. I looked down at my hands. They were stained with a faint, iridescent shimmer, a residue of this altered reality. My reflection in a tidal pool was distorted, my eyes too large, my face elongated alien. The data chip felt heavy, a burden of knowledge that had led me here to this place of altered truths. What was this world now? And if it was this change, this wrong, then where had the entity taken my wife? The wind, a constant companion on this forgotten coast, carried the scent of brine and something else now, a cloying sweetness like the breath of a dying flower. I stood on the damp, packed earth of the coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, the salty spray still stinging my cheeks but no longer cutting through the growing unease. The fisherman who had spoken to me, his face a roadmap of sun-weathered lines, had pointed towards the jagged cliffs that clawed at the bruised twilight sky. He'd said nothing more, just a gesture, a tilt of his head that spoke volumes of unspoken fear. I walked, my boots sinking slightly with each step, the packed earth yielding like sodden bread. The village was a collection of salt-bleached cottages, their windows dark and vacant, as if the inhabitants had simply evaporated. No smoke curled from chimneys, no laughter echoed from open doorways. The only sound was the relentless sigh of the waves against the unseen shore and the mournful cry of gulls wheeling overhead, their shadows long and distorted on the ground. It was a stillness that felt wrong, a vacuum where life ought to pulse. Each calculation, each anomaly, had led me to this desolate place, this final, silent point on the map. It was a canvas meticulously painted, and the artist was not kind. It was a consciousness vast and ancient that perceived existence not as a struggle for survival, but as a symphony of patterns, a grand, unfolding equation. And Earth, our vibrant, chaotic sphere, was a discordant note that needed to be corrected. The fisherman's words, though few, had resonated with a terrifying clarity. He had spoken of the great unraveling, a time when the stars themselves would shift, when the very fabric of what we understood would fray. He had spoken of it not as a prophecy, but as a memory, a cyclical event that had touched this place, this village, countless times before. And he had looked at me, at my worn coat and haunted eyes, and seen not a lost astrophysicist, but a herald. I reached the base of the cliffs. The air grew heavy, thick with the sickly sweet perfume. It clung to my clothes, to my skin, a tangible presence. The rocks here were not like the usual gray granite. They were veined with a subtle iridescent sheen, catching the fading light in a way that made them seem alive, breathing. I ran a hand over the surface. It was unnervingly smooth, almost polished, despite the wind and sea. A faint vibration hummed beneath my fingertips, a low thrum that I felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. The path ahead, a narrow track winding upwards between the sheer rock faces, was barely visible. It was as if the earth itself was reluctant to reveal the way. It sounded like 1,000 tiny voices, murmuring just beyond the edge of audibility. They weren't words, not in any language I knew, but they carried an unmistakable intent. A patient, observing curiosity. The same curiosity that had drawn me into the depths of cosmic data now turned upon me. My breath hitched, the sweet scent intensified, overpowering, and I had to clench my jaw to keep from gagging. The iridescent veins in the rock seemed to pulse with a faint inner luminescence. My own internal rhythm felt alien, a frantic counterpoint to the deep, slow pulse of the world around me. Then I saw it. A fissure in the cliff face, almost perfectly circular, like an eye gazing out at the sea. The entrance was draped with thick, leathery strands, dripping with a viscous, amber-colored fluid. The sweet scent emanated from within, thick and suffocating. This was it. The place the fisherman had alluded to, the nexus of this strange, pervasive influence. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, to flee this place and its unnatural stillness. But the data, the truth it had revealed, held me captive. The entity that shaped the cosmos, that curated reality, was not a distant god. It was an architect, and we were merely a temporary structure in its grand design. It didn't seek to destroy us, not in the way we understood destruction. It sought to integrate us, to rewrite our very existence into its own incomprehensible pattern. I pushed aside the leathery curtains, the touch sending a shiver of revulsion up my arm. The cave opened into a vast, echoing chamber. The air was still, heavy, and the sickly sweet perfume was almost unbearable. The walls were not rock, but a smooth, obsidian-like material that seemed to absorb all light, yet shimmered with faint, internal constellations of light. And at the center of the chamber something pulsed. It wasn't a physical object, not as I understood it. It was a nexus of pure energy, a shimmering, shifting tapestry of impossible colors, woven with threads of light that seemed to bleed into each other. It pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, and with each pulse the air around it warped, the very space seeming to fold and unfold. And as I watched, mesmerized and terrified, I felt a profound shift within myself. The grief for my wife, the gnawing emptiness, the desperate search for meaning, it all began to recede. Not disappear, but to be recontextualized, absorbed into something larger, something infinitely more complex. My memories, my emotions, my very identity felt like individual threads being drawn into the vast, luminous tapestry. It was an assimilation. The entity was not a destroyer, it was a weaver, and it was inviting me to join its design. I looked at my hands, my body, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, I saw them not as flesh and bone, but as a collection of patterns, a temporary configuration of energy that could be reordered, rewritten. The universe was not a place of random chance. It was a meticulously crafted illusion, and this entity was the illusionist. And now it had seen me. It had recognized my awareness, my yearning for understanding, and it had offered me a place within its grand, terrible design. My individual consciousness was a fleeting spark, and this was the eternal flame. I looked at the pulsing nexus, the center of this cosmic loom. My own existence felt fragile, insignificant, yet also, in this moment, infinitely precious. I was a single note, and it was offering to integrate me into a symphony that would stretch across eternity. My gaze drifted to the shimmering patterns, the impossible colors. I felt a pull, a gentle but irresistible invitation, to cease being Thomas, the broken astrophysicist, and to become something else entirely. Something that understood the true nature of reality, that was part of the grand, cosmic tapestry. What would become of the world I left behind? What would become of the memory of my wife, now just another pattern in the vast, unfolding design? And I took a step forward.